today we're going to be looking at a theory lecture on the recognition of revenue. We'll look at an overall summary and go into a bit more details about when to recognize the different components of revenue. Just remember, when we started off of all of these lectures, we said that big issue with revenue recognition is when do you recognize revenue. And that's what we are going to basically be discussing now. So recognition criteria, i.e. when to recognize revenue. Still remember the framework recognition criteria, i.e. future benefits that are probable, and an amount that can be measured reliably. What IAS 18 does is elaborate on these two basic criteria. So first of all, we'll look at revenue from sale of goods. Remember here, the principle is that we will recognize 100% of the revenue in P&L on the transaction date. The question is, when is the transaction date, i.e. when are the recognition criteria met? We're going to look at this in terms of, first, substantially all the risks and rewards of ownership must pass to the buyer. Then any continuing managerial involvement or control must cease. We still have future economic benefits that need to be probable. The amount that needs to be estimated reliably is expanded into two amounts. We must be able to estimate the amount of revenue reliably, as well as the amount of costs associated with that revenue reliably. Okay, so that's revenue from sale of goods. You will recognize all or nothing on one date into P&L. The trick is, which date is the correct date? Please learn these recognition criteria and practice applying them. Then we're going to look at revenue from rendering of services. Here, a little bit more complex, but the basic ideal here is that we would recognize revenue from services, okay, over a period. But there's a bit more of a complexity. First of all, you've got to ask yourself, can the outcome of the transaction be reliably estimated? Okay. If I say yes, then I'll use the stage of completion and I will recognize revenue over time. Okay. If I say no, then the amount of revenue will be limited to the expenses recognized that are recoverable. The question is, how do I know if the outcome of the contract can be estimated reliably? Well, here we've got 4 criteria. The first one, the stage of completion can be measured reliably. That makes sense, right? If I want to use percentage of completion method, i.e. recognize revenue and associated costs over a period of time, well then I've got to be able to work out how far through this contract or the service obligation that I am, so I can recognize revenue and costs appropriately. The rest, pretty straightforward. Future benefits must be probable, and the amount of revenue must be able to be measured reliably. And the last one, number 4, is the costs incurred and still to be incurred must also be able to be measured reliably. Okay, so if those 4 criteria are there, then I will say yes, the outcome of the contract can be estimated reliably, and I will use the stage of completion method. If it says no, then I will limit my revenue to the expenses incurred that are recoverable, i.e. recognize no profit. Just please also remember to look out here. Okay. For situations where the future economic benefits, the revenue, are smaller than the future outflows, the costs. Okay, we'll look at this more when we do IAS 37, but we will do something called an onerous contract and recognize all the losses for the entire contract right up front. Okay, that's an IAS 37 issue. Please make sure you make that link when you're working through IAS 37. Last up, we also get revenue or earn revenue when we allow others to use our entity's assets. Here, the 2 framework criteria are still applicable. Future economic benefits are probable, and the amount of revenue must be able to be measured reliably. The standard then goes on to specify 3 types of revenue. First of all, interest. Interest here will be recorded using the effective interest rate method on the time apportion basis. You will apportion for 6 over 12 months or 8 over 12 months. Dividends. Dividends are only recorded as revenue when the shareholder's right to receive payment is established. A couple of tricks, we'll deal with that in a future lecture. And royalties or other type of intellectual property agreements, you will look at the substance of the agreement and you will use the accrual basis in line with the rest of IFRS accounting. Great, so that's the overall criteria of when to recognize revenue. Please remember that each component, so when I say component, I mean sale of goods, services, interest, dividends, royalties. Each component must be identified, okay? And paragraph 18.13, okay, talks about applying separately each revenue recognition criteria to each component of the transaction, okay? So we must first identify them, apply the recognition criteria separately, okay, in order to reflect the substance of the transaction. A bit of theory, bear with me here. Okay, so for example, when the selling price of a product includes an identifiable amount for servicing. So you go along and you buy yourself a BMW. You pay a contract price of whatever, 100,000 or 500,000. Okay. In that, you land up getting a motor plan. Okay. So the motor plan relates to the servicing, right? What do you do with that? You will defer it and recognize the service component of the revenue over the period to which the service is performed. Okay, that's very important, please, ladies and gentlemen. So remember, when to recognize revenue? Well, you've got your different criteria for sale of goods, your 5 recognition criteria. Services, you must look at the outcome of the transaction. And don't forget about the 3 little funny ones, the interest, the royalties, or the dividends. You must look at each type of revenue or income that you're receiving and split it between these. So you'll have revenue from sale of goods, from services, and maybe interest. You don't just lump them all together. You must split them out and record each of them based on the different criteria. Okay, I hope that's helped. Please remember that. We're going to do a class example now to work with some numbers. Thank you.